All right, well, do you think Bitcoin is an investment or an electronic cash system? Well, most of you out there think it's an investment, according to Grayscale Investments' annual Bitcoin investor study. Grayscale is a sister company to CoinDesk under a parent company, Digital Currency Group. All right, and we had a chart with a breakdown. All told, 77% of people surveyed see Bitcoin as a store of value investment. A bulk of them say BTC is a long-term investment compared to 37% who view it as a short-term play. But Bitcoin was created to be an electronic cash system. Indeed, 26% of people surveyed view Bitcoin as a currency, and they're pretty evenly divided on whether it should be used to pay for goods or services, peer-to-peer money transfer, or are unsure. Results are from an online survey of 1,000 U.S. consumers conducted last August. Respondents were between the ages of 25 and 64 and have at least $10,000 worth of investable assets. Joining us now to discuss is Ray Sharif-Askary, Head of Investor Relations at Grayscale. Hello there, Ray. Thanks for joining us. So just off the bat first, I'd love to get your thoughts on your market's outlook, because we're seeing DeFi soaring right now and an advance in our top coins, ETH and Bitcoin.
It's great to be on. Thank you for having me. And absolutely. So I think, we've had it's been a quiet weekend. I think for us, one of the big themes going into 2022 is actually DeFi. Investors are starting to get a better understanding and embracing the unique use cases associated with the tokens. And this is a space we definitely expect to continue to grow. And I think we're seeing something similar around other layer ones, for instance. So this theme of diversification beyond Bitcoin and Ethereum is something that we're really excited about, and I think we're going to see more of in 2022.
Awesome. And let's get into this investor study on Bitcoin. So what were your top takeaways?
So I think I'm going to highlight 5 things. First, as a surprise to no one, adoption continues to grow. More than a quarter of the people surveyed own Bitcoin. Out of those that don't yet own Bitcoin necessarily, over half of them, 59%, have expressed an interest in learning more or possibly owning Bitcoin in the future. As you touched on, a big takeaway is the perception of Bitcoin as an investment versus money. 3 times as many investors would rather own Bitcoin as an investment vehicle than use it as money. And that's really consistent with what we're seeing from our investors as they continue to view Bitcoin as a long-term investment vehicle. And that's something also that's evidenced by the increase of investors we're seeing use our products in tax-advantaged accounts, in their IRAs. And I think that's a place where we can definitely have more education. I tell everybody, it's like those pharmaceutical commercials. Ask your IRA provider about getting cryptocurrency exposure. The third thing is that Bitcoin is not just for millennials. That's a misconception. Historically, those closer to retirement haven't been as excited about the asset class. This year, we really saw a jump in that segment. 16% more people in that group have now indicated this year over last year that they would either probably or definitely own Bitcoin. Women, also an interesting takeaway. Over half the women we surveyed said that they would be interested in buying Bitcoin potentially. Diversification, we touched on that briefly before. 87% of the investors that own Bitcoin own at least one other digital asset. And that's really consistent with what we've been seeing from our investors as we've launched a suite of products that are meant to give folks access to other layer ones, to DeFi, to the metaverse. We've seen a lot of uptake on those. And then lastly, access at financial institutions. Over 30% of those we interviewed indicated that they would like to have more access at their financial institutions. Crypto has historically been antithetical to the banking model, but clients want access. They're finding ways to get it, and banks are struggling to catch up. And one of the ways that investors are getting access without the banks is using our products. The public quotations, going onto their Schwab account, Fidelity, Vanguard, and just buying these public tickers. And that's really evidence that investors clearly want more access.
Hi, Ray. Happy holidays, and thanks for joining us. Look, in addition to some of the things you highlighted there, I was also struck by some other aspects of the demographics there. So in addition to women now, more than half of them showing an interest in investing in Bitcoin investment products, you've got the 45 to 54 and 55 to 64 age demographic rising quite a bit as well. So I think 46% up from 30% the previous year. What does that tell us, perhaps, about the sort of the shifting mindset broadly politically around Bitcoin? We're going into, an important regulatory year, and the nature of who's invested in this, of course, impacts political decisions.
So I think it's just every day it becomes more real as, not something that's a fun tech investment that millennials dabble in, but that is a real asset class that's, legitimized and that investors want access to. And regulation was a huge theme in 2021. We saw first Bitcoin futures ETF. It was a historic and important moment for not just Bitcoin, but the broader ecosystem. And still, folks want exposure to Bitcoin in the form of a spot ETF. And this survey really corroborates the magnitude of how investor sentiment is shifting. And, that's something we do think that the SEC should approve a Bitcoin spot ETF in the future, maybe in 2022, allowing this group of investors who is now increasingly viewing this asset class as an investment, a long-term investment tool, allowing that group to decide what's best for themselves.
You mentioned the spot ETF. I wonder, do you have an update on what the status is on converting the GBTC trust into a spot ETF? I imagine Grayscale's been discussions with the SEC. Do you have a sense of where they stand?
So we have filed. We've done everything in our power to file to turn turn GBTC into a spot ETF. Right now, that sits with regulators. I think from our perspective, investors understand that this ETF is the most efficient way to resolve any discrepancy around GBTC share price and the NAV. And the hope and expectation is that regulators continue to see this and that we have some positive movement on that front going into the next year.
Do you think it'll be approved next year?
I wish I knew. I wish that I had more clarity into that. I don't think anyone really has a good guess. This is uncharted territory.
I also wanted to mention that the GBTC discount went negative over 21% just a couple of days ago. Why do you think that is? And is that related to that people out there think that the chances of converting the trust to a spot ETF are pretty grim right now?
I think so. The discount, it's always been something, the price of GBTC is subject to supply and demand forces in the market. That's something that's always been the case and that's always going to be the case. And I think sometimes it's just a result of broader market sentiment. I'm not sure what specifically drives, the day-to-day movements, but I think the more important thing is that over time, this is something that we've committed to and that we're going to stay committed to, seeing this converted into a spot ETF.
Ray, I want to pick another little piece out of your survey results here. The question about investing risk tolerance, I thought was pretty interesting. There are, the fact that there are people who define themselves as conservative investors who are now, 50% of them would say that they would consider investing in Bitcoin, whereas people who see themselves as aggressive investors have decreased from 75 to 68. What does that tell us about the perception about what Bitcoin actually is, right? Is it something that is this bet on a gain, or is it something that you use to protect your portfolio? Can you drill down into that a little bit?
I think that's a really great question. I'm glad you brought it up. I think it shows, Bitcoin has several characteristics that make it an attractive investment. You have the upside associated with the technology, you have an uncorrelated asset class, and you've got a store of value. So to me, this shift is actually really positive and shows that investors in a traditional sense are becoming more and more comfortable with the asset class, and that, this year, given the more imminent threat of rising inflation, Bitcoin's becoming more and more of a store of value digital gold asset, and that it's something that's being used in portfolios actually as a hedge against inflation, and is even being embraced by more conservative investors for that purpose. So I think it's reflective of this unprecedented environment that we're in, the stimulus from COVID and the policy response. And I think that it's extremely legitimizing for the asset class and Bitcoin's potential to play a role as a diversifying asset and as an inflation hedge, and not just a way to get a technology upside.
Yeah, there are a lot of points in this study that were interesting. And one of them was that the less formal education you have, the more likely you will invest in Bitcoin. Why do you think that is?
I think that Bitcoin is one of those things that it is a new asset class, and it's a little bit outside of, it's outside of the traditional, outside of the canon of the things we've and the things traditional investment community has embraced. So perhaps if somebody is less indoctrinated, they're going to be more willing to, look at it with open eyes and be more open-minded around it, perhaps.
Mm-hmm. And
Ray,
can you also
all right, I'll take it. So Ray, we're going to the end of the tax year, of course, and you would actually have a guest coming up to talk about it. Wondering, what you're seeing in terms of the GBTC flows with regards to people, making decisions around year-end tax loss booking.
So we're never, we're never allowed to actually talk about anything that touches taxes because we are not tax advisors. But I do think that there are investors out there that are taking advantage of losses going into the new year associated with GBTC, associated with cryptocurrencies in general. And that's something you would expect to see for any asset class, including stocks.
Finally, Ray, just want to get your top predictions for 2022.
So we're focused on 4 things going into the new year. One is regulation, which we touched on. The metaverse is a big theme for us. It's, Facebook's Meta announcement really thrust all of that into the spotlight. I think for years, investors have had to choose these centralized worlds created by social media incumbents. And it's going to be really interesting to see the proliferation of more decentralized metaverses, like Decentraland, for instance, and the way that companies start to engage in those worlds in order to continue to engage their consumers. I think diversification is something we're going to continue to see. We launched, for instance, recently our Solana Trust, alternative layer 1 platforms, met with a lot of interest, showing that investors are increasingly diversifying past Bitcoin and Ethereum. And I think we're going to see that trend grow in 2022 as more retail investors and institutional investors gain a greater understanding and appreciation for the broader ecosystem. Decentralized finance, I think we're going to see an increasing number of market participants using these blockchain-based platforms that offer financial services without the need for traditional intermediaries. We have really compelling alternatives now that are exchanges, lending, derivatives for investors that can't or don't want to deal with the hurdles associated with the traditional intermediaries. And so the incumbents may be more at risk. Capital markets may become more open and egalitarian.